The moment Judge Calvin Mercer saw her walk through those courtroom doors, something shifted behind his eyes. Not guilt. Men like him didn't do guilt. Something colder. Recognition. She didn't rush. She never rushed. Lenora Voss moved through that wood-paneled room the same way she moved through everything, quietly, deliberately, like someone who had already decided how this was going to end before she ever stepped foot inside. Nobody else noticed the judge's reaction. The bailiff was checking his phone. The court reporter was adjusting her headset. The handful of observers in the gallery were half asleep in the morning heat. But Mercer noticed, and Lenora noticed that he noticed. She set her briefcase on the table, clicked it open, and laid 3 folders side by side without looking up. That was all it took. Lenora Voss had grown up believing in the law the way some children grow up believing in God. Her father, Emmett, had spent 31 years as a public defender in Forsyth County, Georgia, never getting rich, never getting famous, but getting people home to their families when the system wanted them buried. He used to say that the law was a river. It could drown you or carry you, depending on who was doing the navigating. He said that a lot, especially in the years before everything fell apart. Emmett Voss was 63 years old when a man named Judge Calvin Mercer decided his career was over. It started with a complaint, a formal grievance filed against Emmett by a private firm called Ashworth Legal Partners, a complaint alleging that Emmett had mishandled client funds, that he had falsified billing records, that he had coerced a witness in a civil case 3 years prior. Every single word of it was fabricated. But the complaint didn't need to be true to be effective. It only needed to be believed by the right people, and in Forsyth County, the right people all sat in the same Sunday pew as Morris Ashworth. The disciplinary board convened. Emmett hired a lawyer. Irony never did have good manners. He gathered records, called witnesses, submitted every document he'd kept in 31 years of meticulous practice. He was not a man who threw things away. He was a man who believed that the truth, properly organized, would always speak for itself. But the hearing officer was a former partner at Ashworth Legal, and the board chair owed Morris Ashworth a favor so large it had its own zip code. And then there was Judge Calvin Mercer, who was not formally part of the disciplinary board, but who submitted a letter. 4 paragraphs, single-spaced, describing what he called a pattern of ethical ambiguity in Emmett Voss's courtroom conduct over the years. A letter full of implication and no specifics. A letter designed not to prove anything but to cast a shadow that would never quite lift. Emmett lost his license on a Tuesday in March. By the following Monday, he had packed the contents of his office into 2 cardboard boxes and driven them home in the back of his Buick. He put the boxes in the garage. He never opened them again. Lenora was 29 years old when that happened. She was finishing her 2nd year of law school at Howard, surviving on loans and dining hall coffee, calling her father every Sunday night to hear him talk about his cases. After the Tuesday in March, those calls changed. He still answered. He still asked about her classes. But the current was gone from his voice, the way you can tell a fire has gone out not because the room is cold yet, but because the sound is different. She drove home that spring break. They sat on the back porch, and her father told her the whole story in the same patient, precise way he used to narrate closing arguments. Every date, every document, every name. When he finished, he poured himself another glass of sweet tea and said, "I'm not asking you to do anything about this, Nora. I just need somebody to know." She wrote everything down. 7 years passed. Lenora graduated from Howard, passed the Georgia bar on her first attempt, and took a job at the U.S. Attorney's office in Atlanta as a junior prosecutor. She was good at the work, careful, methodical, the kind of lawyer who read every exhibit twice and never asked a question she didn't already know the answer to. She made friends slowly and kept them. She went home to Forsyth County on holidays and watched her father tend the garden he'd started after he lost his license, because he needed something to do with his hands. What she didn't tell anyone, not her colleagues, not her friends, not even her father, was that she had never stopped working on his case. Every night after the office cleared out, or on Saturday mornings with the blinds half drawn, she pulled out the folder. She followed the money that Ashworth Legal Partners had moved through 3 shell accounts in the years surrounding Emmett's disbarment. She tracked the timeline of disciplinary cases in Forsyth County and identified a pattern. 13 other defense attorneys, all of them representing clients adverse to Ashworth's firm, all of them subjected to grievance filings in the preceding decade. 9 of those filings had come through Mercer's courtroom. 9. She filed public records requests. She developed sources. She was patient in a way that scared her sometimes. The patience of someone who had decided that waiting was not the same as accepting. In her 4th year at the U.S. Attorney's Office, she transferred to the Public Corruption Unit. Nobody asked why. The case that finally opened the door was not Emmett Voss's case. It was the case of a woman named Phyllis Garner, a 51-year-old paralegal who had worked for Ashworth Legal Partners for 11 years before discovering that the firm was systematically overbilling clients, mostly elderly black homos facing foreclosure, and pocketing the difference through a complex fee-splitting arrangement with several county court officials. Phyllis had taken her concerns to Morris Ashworth himself. 2 weeks later, she was terminated for performance issues. She came to the U.S. Attorney's Office with a box of documents she'd kept at home. Photocopies, mostly. Bank statements. Internal memos. Emails that someone should have deleted but hadn't. The agent who took her initial statement was named Deshaun Pryor. He was thorough and he was good, and when he read through Phyllis Garner's documents, he walked down the hall to Public Corruption and set them on Lenora's desk without a word. She read the first page, then the second. Then she closed the box, leaned back in her chair, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "How solid is she?" she asked. "Rock," Deshaun said. "How fast can we move? Depends on how high you want to go." Lenora looked at him. All the way. The investigation took 14 months. During those 14 months, Lenora Voss did not sleep well. She ate at her desk more often than not. She ran 6 miles every morning before the sun came up because it was the only hour of the day when her brain was quiet enough to think clearly. She called her father every Sunday, same as always, and did not tell him anything. The FBI came in at the 8-month mark when the financial forensics reached a point that required their resources. Agent Tamara Wiley led the federal side. Precise, no nonsense, with the kind of calm authority that made people either trust her immediately or distrust her for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Lenora trusted her. They followed 37 distinct financial threads. 12 of them led back, in one way or another, to Judge Calvin Mercer. There were payments, disguised as consulting fees, to a company Mercer's brother-in-law had incorporated in Delaware. There were case outcomes that correlated with those payments, with a consistency that couldn't be attributed to coincidence. There were the disciplinary letters, Emmett's and 8 others. Each one filed within weeks of a payment being made to that Delaware company. There were witnesses, 2 former Ashworth associates who had grown for conscience or grown afraid, the 2 sometimes being indistinguishable. A court clerk who had been asked to backdate a filing and had quietly kept a copy of the original. Phyllis Garner, who remembered everything. On a Thursday in February, a federal grand jury returned indictments against Morris Ashworth, 3 of his partners, 2 county officials, and Judge Calvin Mercer. The charges included bribery, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Lenora signed the indictment documents in her office at 6:15 in the morning, before anyone else arrived. She sat there for a while after, in the quiet. Then she called her father. She did not tell him she was involved. She told him to turn on the news. He called her back 11 minutes later. She could hear that the current was back in his voice. Not loud, not triumphant, but present. The way light comes back into a room when someone opens the blinds. "Nora," he said. "Yeah, Dad." A long pause. "How long?" 7 years. Another pause. "Longer. You should have told me." "I know. Why didn't you?" She thought about that for a moment. "Because I didn't want you to watch me fail." She heard him exhale. The kind of exhale that carries a whole weight with it. "When do you have to be in court?" he asked. 2 weeks. "I'm coming," he said. "I know you are." The courtroom was wood and marble, and the kind of institutional quiet that made everything feel permanent. Lenora had been in dozens of courtrooms since law school, but this one felt different from the moment she walked through the door. Maybe it was the gallery, already half full, even though they were 40 minutes from the start. Maybe it was the way the morning light came through the tall windows, at an angle that made the dust motes visible in the air. Or maybe it was her father, sitting in the 3rd row on the left, his hands folded on his knees, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to her law school graduation. She didn't look at him long. Didn't need to. She set her briefcase on the prosecutor's table, clicked it open, and laid 3 folders side by side. The defense attorneys for Mercer and the Ashworth partners filed in behind her. 4 of them, expensive suits, the particular confidence of people who had never lost anything they weren't prepared to lose. They exchanged glances when they saw her. One of them, she thought his name was Patterson, leaned toward his colleague and said something she couldn't hear. She didn't need to hear it. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. The presiding judge, the Honorable Renata Voss, brought in from the Northern District of Alabama specifically to avoid any conflict of interest, entered and took her seat with the efficiency of someone who had no time for theater, and then the marshal brought in the defendants. Calvin Mercer walked in last. He was 64 years old, silver-haired, still carrying himself with the posture of a man who had spent decades at the highest in every room he entered. He sat down at the defense table, scanned the room the way he always had, Lenora imagined, assessing, calculating, deciding who mattered and who didn't. His eyes found her. She held his gaze and said nothing. She watched the moment when he understood, not just who she was, but what she had done. Watched something shift in his face, beneath the practiced composure. Not guilt. Men like him still didn't do guilt. But something close to fear, which for a man like Mercer was probably worse. Judge Voss called the proceedings to order. Lenora stood. "Good morning, Your Honor." Her voice was even. "The United States is prepared to proceed." The first day of testimony belonged to Phyllis Garner. She took the stand in a brown blazer and pearl earrings, and she answered every question the same way she'd answered them in every prep session. Directly, precisely, without embellishment and without apology. She had a bookkeeper's memory and a bookkeeper's instinct for documentation, and she walked the jury through 11 years of Ashey's-Worth Legal's billing practices with the patience of a woman who had spent a decade filing papers that nobody read. Lenora had prepared her well. But some witnesses don't need much preparation. Some people, when they finally get a room and a microphone, know exactly what to do with them. When the defense cross-examined Phyllis, Patterson tried the usual moves, attacking her credibility, implying personal motives, suggesting that her so-called documentation was selectively gathered. Phyllis watched him the way you watch weather. She answered what he asked, and nothing more. She did not get rattled. She did not get loud. At one point, Patterson asked her why she hadn't come forward sooner. Phyllis looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the jury. "Because I didn't think anyone would listen," she said. "Because I'd watched what happened to the people who tried." The courtroom was very quiet after that. The second week was when the financial evidence came in. The Delaware Company records, the wire transfers, the timeline that Lenora's team had spent 14 months assembling like the world's most damning jigsaw puzzle. The forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Celeste Okonkwo, spent 2 days on the stand walking the jury through a chart that showed, with the kind of visual clarity that made defense objections feel almost rude, the direct correlation between payments to Mercer's brother-in-law's company and favorable rulings in cases involving Ashworth's clients. Patterson objected 14 times during Dr. Okonkwo's testimony. Judge Voss overruled 13 of them. When Lenora redirected after cross, she asked one question. "Dr. Okonkwo, in your professional opinion, based on the totality of the financial records you reviewed, is there a legitimate, non-criminal explanation for the payment pattern you've described?" Dr. Okonkwo considered this for exactly 3 seconds. "No," she said, "there is not." The moment that the courtroom would talk about afterward. The moment that would end up in the legal blog recaps and the letters to the editor and the comment sections of every news story about the trial, came on the third Wednesday, during Lenora's examination of a witness named Bernard Cole. Bernard Cole was 68 years old, a retired county clerk, who had worked in the Forsyth County Courthouse for 22 years. He was not a dramatic man. He wore a plaid shirt. He drove a 2009 Camry. He had asked once about being compensated for his travel expenses and had accepted the answer of no without complaint. But Bernard Cole had, 8 years ago, been handed a document by a court administrator and told to refile it with the previous day's date. He had looked at the document. He had looked at the administrator, and then he had gone home that evening and made a photocopy of the original, with its original timestamp, and put it in an envelope in the shoebox under his bed, because his mother had always told him that a man with nothing in writing has nothing at all. That envelope had been in the shoebox for 8 years. When Lenora's investigator had found Bernard Cole, he'd been living quietly in retirement, growing tomatoes and watching old westerns. He had brought the envelope to their first meeting without being asked. Lenora introduced the document into evidence on a Wednesday morning. Exhibit 47, a motion filing with 2 timestamps, the original from Bernard Cole's photocopy, and the refilled version, dated the day before, which appeared in the official court record. The difference between those 2 dates had determined the outcome of a case worth $4.3 million to Ashworth's client. The difference between those 2 dates had sent a man named Darius Webb to prison for 3 years for a crime a different timeline proved he couldn't have committed. Lenora paused after introducing the exhibit. Let the jury look at it. "Mr. Cole," she said, "why did you keep that photocopy?" Bernard Cole looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. "Because I knew it wasn't right," he said, "and I figured someday somebody was going to want to know." The defense made its closing argument on a Thursday. Patterson was skilled. She had to give him that. He worked the reasonable doubt standard hard, questioned the motivations of the government's witnesses, painted a picture of an overreaching prosecution pursuing a distinguished jurist on the basis of circumstantial correlation and the testimony of disgruntled former employees. It was a good argument. Competent. Well-structured. It just wasn't stronger than the evidence. Lenora stood for the government's closing on Friday morning. She did not use notes. She stood in front of the jury box and she spoke quietly, the way her father had always spoken in courtrooms, because quiet voices make people lean in, and people who lean in are people who are listening. She talked about Phyllis Garner, who had watched and waited until someone finally gave her a room to tell the truth in. She talked about Bernard Cole and the shoebox and the 8 years of patience. She talked about Darius Webb, who had served 3 years for something he didn't do and whose name deserved to be in this room, even if he wasn't in it. She talked about the 37 financial threads and where each of them led. And then she talked about what it means when the law stops being a river and becomes a wall, when the people who are supposed to navigate it for you are the ones building the barrier. She talked about what that does to a community, to a family, to a man who spent 31 years doing this work and had it taken from him on the strength of a letter and a political favor. She did not say her father's name. She didn't need to. He was in the 3rd row, in the navy suit, and the jury could see him the same way they could see everything else in that room. "This case," she said, at the end, "is not about ambition. It's not about politics. It is about a simple question that every person in this room already knows the answer to." She paused. "What does it cost when justice is for sale?" She let the silence sit. "The evidence has given you the receipt," she said. "Now you know the price." She sat down. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. Lenora spent most of that time at the office, reading briefs for other cases, drinking too much coffee, not sleeping. Her father stayed in a hotel 2 blocks from the courthouse. They had dinner together both evenings, at a diner, not a restaurant, because her father believed that good news and bad news both tasted better in places with laminate menus and coffee that came in ceramic mugs. They didn't talk about the case. They talked about his tomatoes. They talked about a documentary he'd been watching about migratory birds. They talked about the neighbor's dog who had finally stopped digging under the fence. On the second evening, just before they called it a night, her father reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Whatever happens," he said. "I know," she said. "No, I mean it. Whatever happens. You went after the truth. That's what I raised you to do. That's what this work is supposed to be." She nodded. Didn't trust her voice. "You're a better lawyer than I ever was," he said. "Don't argue with me. I've been watching lawyers for 40 years. She laughed, despite herself. "You've been watching me for 7. That's all I needed." The jury came back on a Thursday afternoon at 2:17, guilty on all counts. All 6 defendants. Calvin Mercer stood when the verdict was read and showed nothing. Held his face still with the practiced discipline of a man who had controlled rooms for decades. But Lenora was watching his hands, and his hands were gripping the edge of the defense table, hard enough that his knuckles paled. She watched him for a moment. Then she looked away. Behind her, she heard the sound of the gallery. A collective exhale, a murmur, the particular sound of a room that has been holding its breath and finally lets go. She heard something else, too, a single sound from the 3rd row. Not a cheer, not a word, just a breath, long and slow, the sound of a weight being set down after 7 years. She did not turn around. She pressed her palms flat against the table and looked straight ahead. Judge Osei thanked the jury. She remanded the defendants pending sentencing. She banged the gavel, and then it was over. Outside the courthouse, on the wide stone steps in the February cold, Lenora's father put his arms around her and held on. He smelled like the same aftershave he'd worn her whole life. She stood there and let herself be his daughter for a moment, before the phone started ringing and the reporters started gathering at the bottom of the steps and everything became official again. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly against her shoulder. She thought about it. "Go get coffee," she said, "at that diner." He laughed. A full laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from him in a long time. "You got it." They stood there a little longer while the city moved around them, while the day kept going the way days do, indifferent to verdicts and revolutions, and the small private moments where everything shifts back into place. Then Emmett Voss straightened up, buttoned his coat against the cold, and offered his daughter his arm, and she took it.